that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe. For this victory, we join in offering our thanks to the Providence which has guided and sustained us through the dark days of adversity and into light. Much remains to be done. The victory won in the West must now be won in the East. The whole world must be cleansed of the evil from which half the world has been freed.
President Kennedy begins a tour of 4 space installations at Huntsville, Alabama, where he is greeted by Dr. Wernher von Braun, space pioneer and director of this research and development center.
Welcome back to the third installment of the podcasts and video essays for this semester. This video essay will not be covering our readings or the video you're supposed to watch directly, but will instead be about a United States classified project called Operation Paperclip, as well as a man mentioned in the YouTube video we were to watch, Wernher von Braun, who was one of the men involved in Operation Paperclip. As a warning before we start, this video essay has to do with the Nazis and the Nazi SS, their crimes against humanity, their eventual safety in the US and in US intelligence and scientific agencies, and will include footage of these things. So, if you do not feel comfortable watching it, then click off now. But if you are okay with watching it as it is history, please know that all these videos and photos are being used for educational purposes only, and I do not support any of the actions. This is about a story you probably have never heard before. The US government agencies inviting the men who they just fought a world war against, and because of whom they developed nuclear weapons, to the United States. A safe haven, records cleaned, any Nazi relations scrubbed, presidents in the know, and also presidents who supported it, just so that the USSR doesn't look good, just so we can flex the righteousness of capitalism. Usually, when an army wins a war, they take all the spoils from the defeated enemy, and then leave that enemy to build themselves back up. But following World War II, the United States took a different approach. They took in Nazi and SS scientists and engineers, as well as those who helped in and were aware of the Holocaust, employed them in various government agencies, and scrubbed their records clean of any wrongdoing during the war. Despite our government knowing that these 1,600 scientists that they invited to the US were engaged in crimes against humanity, they were able to start new lives, usually under new names and with newly clean and spotless records. Some even had government protection. President Harry S. Truman had full knowledge of this and supported it too. He was one of the main minds in the US government behind this classified program. These men, who took part in the largest single ethnic cleansing in history, were allowed to work for the country and its agencies. Some men even got to the top of the agencies, like NASA, that just fought against the very same science that they were about to do for the United States. This classified program to house, protect, and employ Nazis was called Operation Paperclip. It is important to start this off with the invasion of Normandy. Among the armies closing in on the Germans, there are men whose mission it was to discover, catalog, and obtain German technologies. This was due to the popular belief that the early Nazi victories in Europe were because of superior German technology and engineering. In 1943, the British and U.S. intelligence agencies and military forces launched a joint mission called Alsace in order to discover Germany's capacity in the ABCs, which means atomic, biological, and chemical weapons. One of the important stipulations of this mission was to not let any obtained information or physical technology fall into Soviet hands, so that the Western powers would have a hand above the Soviets. In order to make sure this happened, the US decided that using Nazi or German research was the best path. While the Soviets were making their way towards Berlin, the Nazis pulled together a list of top scientists, engineers, and technicians, and wanted to take them back to Berlin, away from the front, and have them be there for the final defense of the Reich. A man named Werner Osenberg, a materials scientist, armaments researcher, and armaments developer for the Nazis, was put in charge of forming this list. In 1945, a Polish lab assistant in Bonn, Germany, came across a copy of Osenberg's list and turned it over to British and American intelligence. This list of important Nazi thinkers was the basis of the list of scientists that the United States would later pursue in the recruitment during Operation Paperclip. After the war was ended, the process of denazification began, which included showing video reels of the atrocities committed to everyone, as well as prosecuting anyone associated with the Nazi Party in order to kill the Nazis both militarily and ideologically. Among these people who were to be put before judges were almost all, if not all, of the 1,600 scientists recruited and hired by the US. At first, there was a distinction made between, these aren't my words by the way, quote, ardent Nazis and, quote, moderate Nazis. The distinction was to see who could be tolerated by the Allied governments and who was to be sent before an international court to be tried. The distinction rested on who it seemed was a willing participant in the Holocaust or any other crimes committed by the Nazi Reich, and those who became Nazi members only in order to not be ostracized by the party and have their careers be ruined. Soon, however, this distinction wore away. This can be easily seen through the preference given to Werner von Braun, who became a Nazi member in 1937 and joined the Schutzstaffel, the SS, in 1940 after an invitation directly from Heinrich Himmler, and cemented himself as the leading brain in the field of rocketry. This is evidence of the US no longer staying with the morals of putting away responsible Nazis forever, and instead, they prioritize anything, no matter how evil or how much killing that the man did, that could get them ahead of the Soviets in order to defeat communism. They would now tolerate the lowest of human depravity only if they thought that the man's technical ability and theoretical thinking could be of benefit. Von Braun's work had been recognized in the early 1930s by Walter Dornberger, and pursued him to use his skill in rocketry for military weapons. Von Braun's most famous, or infamous, creation for the Nazis was the Vergeltungswaffe II rocket, literally Retaliation Weapon 2, commonly called Vengeance Weapons or simply V2 rockets. These V2 rockets were first used on London on the 6th of September 1944. The rocket traveled over 200 miles in only a few minutes. The V2 rocket was also supersonic, meaning that nothing of the time could stop it, as there were no defense systems capable of such. These rockets, von Braun's specialty, resulted in the death of around 9,000 people, mostly civilians. However, the higher death toll from the rocket came from the people who were forced laborers who dug out an underground factory which was used to work on and house the rockets. Almost all of the slaves came from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, and were often either worked until they died from exhaustion, or were beaten and murdered because they weren't working hard enough. At the end of the war, von Braun and others made their way to the American front lines, away from the more fanatical SS members, who wished to have one last stand in Berlin in defense of the Reich. Von Braun and these other men were captured by the Americans and brought to Castle Kranzberg, the former headquarters of the Luftwaffe. But by the end of 1945, von Braun was in America, stationed at Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas. He, and other men he surrendered with, were here to continue their research and work on aerospace. And by the 1950s, von Braun had created his Redstone rocket system, which was later used in the first live nuclear ballistic missile tests conducted by the United States. Von Braun really wanted to popularize the idea of human space travel while he was in the US, and pushed for the idea with his help from his friend, Walt Disney, which is interesting that Disney and von Braun were friends, considering Walt Disney's intense anti-Semitism and von Braun's Nazi past. And together, they produced a couple programs to boost the idea. Wernher von Braun featured in a 1955 Disney TV special called Man in the Moon, and on Time magazine cover in 1958, was a leading architect of America's successful space program after World War II. He became the director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, developing the Saturn V rocket that took Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to the moon in 1969. He was an American hero, an icon of rocket engineering, and a master of the art of image making. But what was the truth behind his image? He was brought to the US in a clandestine intelligence program called Operation Paperclip. In 1958, NASA was formed in response to the successful launch of the Sputnik satellite by the USSR. Knowing how good von Braun's rocket technology was, NASA brought him in to work for them, and by 1961, he created the Mercury Redstone rocket, which launched the first American into space. But the US was still behind the Soviets. The Saturn V rocket, though, was von Braun's best work, which would eventually be the rocket which landed the first humans on the moon. Would all of this US success in the space field have been possible without the men recruited through Operation Paperclip? And especially without von Braun? More examples of Nazis in US agencies are men like Hubertus Strughold and Kurt Blume. Strughold was a German researcher who had very close and friendly relations with men high up in the Nazi Party, men like Hermann Göring. While Strughold was never an official Nazi member, his research into the effects of flight on the human body, as well as other subjects, were used on prisoners in concentration camps, most notably at Dachau. It is not known whether Strughold had a direct hand in the torture done at these concentration camps, but he most definitely benefited from the research. Also, Strughold was one of the men prosecuted by the Allies at Nuremberg for being responsible for the crimes committed at Dachau. Strughold ran an institution called the Institution for Aviation Medicine. While at this institute, he experimented on 6 epileptic children to test the effects of hypoxia on humans. And if you don't know, hypoxia is just the lack of oxygen given to muscles or any other area of the human body. So basically high altitudes, mountaintops, space, that sort of thing. To do this, he and his colleagues would place these epileptic children in vacuum chambers, which led to increased and even more intense seizures and the eventual death of these children. He did this all in the name of scientific research. After being shipped to the US, Strughold continued his research, but this time for the Americans. His research was about astrobiology, which was a term he came up with himself, or simply just space medicine. He wanted to gain knowledge about the effects of space travel on the human body. Strughold conducted very important studies on issues such as atmospheric control, the physical effects of weightlessness, and the disruption of normal time cycles. Even after having been proven to have had a hand in the torture of concentration camp victims, Strughold was granted permanent U.S. citizenship in July 1956, and then went on to be the chief scientist of the Aerospace Medical Division, AMD, of the U.S. Air Force Systems Command in February 1962. Just like von Braun, he was also brought over to America as part of Operation Paperclip. As mentioned before, another example of a former Nazi being given safe haven in the U.S. is Kurt Blome. He was the Reichsgesundheitsführer, which means Deputy Reich Health Leader, and Plenipotentiary for Cancer Research in the Reich Research Council. As Plenipotentiary for Cancer Research in the Third Reich, Blome had a long-standing interest in the, quote, military use of carcinogenic substances, and also with cancer-causing viruses. He aided the Reich in their use of the bubonic plague, cholera, typhoid, and anthrax as biological weapons to be used against the Allies. In 1943, Blome proposed spreading malaria, quote, artificially by means of mosquitoes, and experimented on prisoners at Dachau and Buchenwald with lice in order to cause typhus epidemics. Blome also worked on aerosol dispersants and methods of spraying nerve agents like tabun and sarin from aircraft, and tested the effects of these gases on prisoners at Auschwitz. One can only ask whether Blome's work with the U.S. about dispersing nerve agents through aircraft was used during the Vietnam War, like with Agent Orange, on the civilians and military men of Vietnam. Whether he had direct impact or not is not known, and I don't necessarily want to put in any speculation, but it's a thought that one should think. Blome also engaged in exchange of research findings with the infamous Japanese Unit 731, which, honestly, committed some of the worst crimes against humanity during the entire Second World War. And even to this day, Japan still denies the existence of or simply refuses to comment on Unit 731, despite the plethora of evidence proving its existence. And that's a topic which you should research on your own, because it's really bad, but I can't cover that today. Blome was also brought on to aid the creation of the CIA's MK-Ultra program by Sidney Gottlieb. And if you're going to say the MK-Ultra program is just a conspiracy theory, there are declassified CIA documents which prove the existence of the MK-Ultra program that you can find yourself, that are fully publicly available and have been released by the CIA themselves, on their website too. Kurt Blome evaded conviction in the 1947 Nuremberg doctors' trial and was never pursued by any foreign intelligence again, despite being a main part of many crimes committed by both the Reich and by Imperial Japan. Blome continued to practice medicine for the rest of his life in West Germany and joined a national conservative political party called the Deutsche Partei, literally the German party, which was ultra-nationalistic in nature and wanted the return of the German Empire, something that Hitler himself was after. In addition to these scientists, there is much documentation of the CIA using former Nazis or Nazi collaborators in order to spy on Soviet networks in Eastern and Central Europe. It has been called Operation Gladio. The CIA created many stay-behind groups, hired and paid Nazis who would be used to spy on East Germany or any Soviets who they came across. This can be seen through the 1998 Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act, in which the CIA has documentation of hiring men like Nazi SS Staff Sergeant Heinrich Hoffmann and Nazi SS Lieutenant Colonel Hans Roos. They also hired a, quote, unreconstructed Nazi for use in clandestine actions, Nazi Lieutenant Colonel Walter Kopp. Would the US have reached such high heights without the use of these former Nazis? Is the use of men who have just committed incredibly horrendous acts for your country's personal gain against another justifiable? Or is it despicable? One thing is for certain. You can't change what they did, either Nazi or in the US government. But at least we know who in our government was soft enough to let these Nazis in. Some are guilty, but all are responsible.